You're standing by a fire in 50,000 BC. The sun is set, and there's no Netflix, no text messages, and no email notifications waiting for you. Just the fire, the darkness, and a thick cloud of smoke billowing straight into your face. At some point, one of your ancestors must have stared at that smoke and wondered what would happen if they deliberately inhaled it. This is the story of how humans may have discovered smoking. Not cigarettes, not cigars, not the familiar modern habit revolving around tobacco. We're talking about the first time a human intentionally inhaled something burning, and why that behavior may predate civilization itself. Because smoking didn't begin with colonial trade, documented Native American rituals, agriculture, or even tobacco. The instinct to inhale smoke may have originated during a time when humans were still exploring how different plants might affect the body and mind. The evidence is strange, incomplete, and truly remarkable, and that altered the timeline. But before anyone could choose to inhale smoke, one essential thing had to exist first: fire. And fire has accompanied the human journey for an incredibly long time. The earliest widely accepted evidence that our ancestors deliberately controlled fire comes from a place called Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, dating back roughly 1 million years. There, archaeologists uncovered layers of burned plant ash together with charred animal bones. These were not the random leftovers of a natural wildfire. They were the remains of a fire that had been intentionally maintained inside a cave over an extended period of time. What's even more remarkable is that 1 million years ago, we weren't Homo sapiens yet. The species gathered around those flames was Homo erectus, one of our earlier relatives, equipped with a smaller brain, a much heavier brow ridge, and probably no interest whatsoever in anyone giving them advice about how to use fire. Yet in many ways, their evenings looked surprisingly familiar. They gathered around the flames. They cooked food. They kept themselves warm. They crowded together after sunset. And while doing all of that, they breathed in smoke. For hundreds of thousands of years, every human and every human ancestor that spent time beside a campfire inhaled smoke. There was simply no way around it. It happened constantly. It was an unavoidable part of daily life. In a sense, it was humanity's original air pollution problem. Except there wasn't exactly an app available to warn you that today's air quality was unhealthy. But this is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating. Not every cloud rising from a fire was made only from burning wood. Whenever organic material burns, the result isn't limited to carbon dioxide and water vapor. The exact mixture depends entirely on what has been thrown into the flames. Certain plants, once set on fire, give off more than ordinary smoke. They can release psychoactive chemicals, alkaloids, terpenes, and other compounds capable of interacting with the human nervous system in ways that are, to put it gently, extremely noticeable. Put more plainly, some of our ancestors were almost certainly getting accidentally high beside the campfire, with absolutely no understanding of why they suddenly felt so good. And this is not some obscure theory sitting at the edge of serious research. For decades, researchers have suggested that early humans living in wooded environments would have been repeatedly exposed to smoke from naturally occurring psychoactive plants, including cannabis, different Nicotiana species, and a range of entheogenic plants growing across Africa, Europe, and Asia. The human brain, as it happens, contains receptors that react to cannabinoids. Those receptors did not evolve because humans needed cannabis. They belong to the endocannabinoid system, an internal biological network involved in regulating everything from mood and memory to hunger and appetite. But because that system was already present, the first human who breathed in smoke from a burning cannabis plant did not have a brain that simply stared at the chemical signal in confusion. The response was probably closer to, "Oh, there you are. I was wondering when you would show up." In that moment, the first accidental breath of psychoactive smoke drifting from a prehistoric fire may have been the real beginning of smoking. It was not a carefully considered choice. It was not an invention planned in advance. It may have been nothing more than an unusually pleasant accident, repeated often enough that eventually somebody decided to make it happen again on purpose. Pause and consider what that would mean. The entire global tobacco industry, now worth multiple trillions of dollars, along with centuries of ritual practice, shamanic tradition, medical treatment, and social custom, may ultimately trace back to one exhausted hunter sitting downwind from the wrong plant and having a far better evening than expected. History has a strange habit of becoming beautiful in the most ridiculous possible ways. But this is also the point where we need to become extremely careful with the timeline. Because saying that ancient humans inhaled the smoke of certain plants is not the same as saying that ancient humans deliberately grew specific plants in order to smoke them. Those are two very different claims. So let us move away from possibility for a moment and look at what the archaeological evidence actually shows. The oldest direct evidence currently associated with intentional cannabis use comes from a burial site in the Pamir Mountains of Central Asia, dating to around 500 BC. In this case, archaeologists were not simply finding a few cannabis seeds scattered near an ancient settlement. Excavators uncovered wooden braziers holding stones that had been heated to extremely high temperatures, together with chemical residue left by cannabis plants containing unusually elevated levels of THC. This was not ordinary wild cannabis gathered mainly for rope, fiber, or food-producing seeds. This was the potent material, and it had been placed directly inside a ritual burial setting. The date was approximately 500 BC, which puts the evidence at around 2,500 years old. But there should already be a question forming quietly in the back of your mind. If we have not discovered physical evidence older than that, does it mean people were not doing it earlier? Or does it simply mean the earlier evidence has not survived long enough for us to find it? Because organic materials, seeds, leaves, plant fibers, dried herbs, almost never remain intact in the ground for thousands upon thousands of years, we can recover stone tools made 3 million years ago because stone is, for practical purposes, nearly impossible to destroy. But a wooden pipe packed with dried plants would normally disappear after only a few centuries beneath the soil. A leather pouch holding cannabis would have broken down and returned to the earth long before an archaeologist arrived carrying a trowel. So in this particular case, the absence of evidence is very definitely not evidence that the behavior was absent. And then there is what we might call the Herodotus problem. Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian writing during the 5th century BC, recorded an unusually detailed account of the Scythians, a nomadic people who lived across the Eurasian steppe. He described them performing something he referred to as a vapor bath. According to his account, they constructed small enclosed tents, heated stones until they were glowing, threw hemp seeds onto the hot surfaces, and then sat inside breathing the thick smoke. Herodotus wrote that the Scythians responded by howling with pleasure. For centuries, historians assumed that he had either exaggerated the scene or misunderstood whatever ritual he had witnessed. Then, archaeologists began opening Scythian burial mounds, and inside, they found exactly what you would now expect them to find. Bronze braziers, stones that had clearly been heated, and traces of hemp residue. The material evidence matched the strange scene Herodotus had described centuries earlier with remarkable precision. The man had not invented the story, he had not decorated it for dramatic effect, he was simply writing down what he saw, and if anything, he may have made the whole event sound less intense than it really was. Now let's turn to tobacco, because for most people, tobacco is the first thing that comes to mind when they hear the word smoking. Tobacco belongs to the genus Nicotiana, and it originally comes from the Americas. That detail is enormously important, because it means the great civilizations of the old world, Europe, Africa, and Asia, had no knowledge of tobacco at all until sustained contact with the Americas began near the end of the 15th century. When European sailors reached the Caribbean in 1492, they almost immediately noticed local people doing something that looked deeply strange to them. Columbus recorded seeing men and women carrying small burning rolls made from dried leaves, drawing the smoke into their bodies, then releasing it through the mouth and nose. His crew did not understand what they were watching. His crew also tried it themselves within a matter of weeks, because naturally they did. But tobacco use in the Americas did not begin in 1492. Not even close. Archaeologists have identified tobacco residues inside ancient pipes from the southeastern United States, dating back at least 3,500 years. Some researchers suspect the practice may be much older, perhaps 10,000 years old or more, and connected to the early cultivation of useful plants in and around the Amazon basin. And here's the part that changes the entire meaning of tobacco in the ancient Americas. It was not mainly recreational. It was sacred. Tobacco appeared in healing ceremonies, in contact with spirits, and in agreements made between communities or tribes. Blowing smoke over another person could serve as a blessing, an expression of respect, or a way of creating connection. A shaman who smoked was not stepping outside for a casual cigarette between tasks. He was attempting to open a passage between the human world and something beyond it. The smoke itself could be understood as alive, a carrier moving between realms, lifting prayers upward and returning with visions, guidance, or messages. That way of seeing tobacco matters because it helps explain why its use remained so structured, controlled, and ritualized in many indigenous cultures for thousands of years. When a substance is treated as sacred, people surround it with rules. They approach it with caution. They use it with purpose. They do not smoke one cigarette after another while half watching television. The idea that tobacco should become an ordinary daily habit, something to do during a lunch break, while waiting for a bus, or whenever a person feels bored, is largely a European creation. And historically speaking, it is a surprisingly recent one. Now let's move much farther back, because one discovery in the story is rarely discussed, even though it may represent the oldest known evidence of intentional tobacco use anywhere in the archaeological record. In 2019, researchers reported a remarkable find from the Great Salt Lake Desert in Utah. At the site, they uncovered an ancient hearth used for cooking and warmth. It was approximately 12,000 years old. Inside that hearth were seeds from Nicotiana attenuata, a wild tobacco plant native to North America. These were not a few random seeds that happened to blow into the flames. They appeared in a concentrated pattern that suggested someone had deliberately brought them there and placed them in or near the fire. The discovery was especially striking because it predates every known pipe and pottery object from that region by several thousand years. In other words, people may have been using tobacco long before they had any of the artifacts we normally associate with smoking. That pushed the possible history of tobacco use in the Americas much deeper into the past, and it created a much larger question. If humans were placing tobacco into fires 12,000 years ago, whether to breathe the smoke, perform a ritual, or perhaps do both, then what were human beings in other parts of the world doing with their own local psychoactive plants at exactly the same time? Because 12,000 years ago, our species was already spread across the planet. Humans lived in Africa. They lived throughout Asia and Europe. They had reached Australia. They were surrounded everywhere by plants capable of affecting pain, mood, perception, sleep, fear, and consciousness. And the desire to change the way the mind feels is not something unique to the Americas. It is something deeply human. Here is an idea that may initially sound extreme, but respected anthropologists and researchers have taken it seriously: the intoxication hypothesis. The basic argument is simple. Across nearly every human culture ever studied, people have discovered methods of altering consciousness. They fermented drinks, they ate psychedelic mushrooms, they inhaled smoke, they chewed leaves, they swallowed roots, seeds, and other plant materials. This pattern is so widespread, so persistent through history, and so often developed independently that some researchers argue it cannot be dismissed as a cultural accident. In the 1980s, UCLA psychopharmacologist Ronald Siegel proposed that the pursuit of intoxication might function as a fourth biological drive, existing alongside hunger, thirst, and sex. In his view, this impulse was not limited to humans. It could be part of animal behavior more broadly. Elephants have been reported seeking out fermented marula fruit. Reindeer in Siberia have been observed eating Amanita muscaria mushrooms, then consuming the urine of other reindeer that had eaten those mushrooms, because the psychoactive chemicals can pass through the body without breaking down completely. So yes, Siberian reindeer may have discovered a form of drug recycling. Honestly, you have to respect the commitment. The larger point is that if the desire to alter consciousness is this ancient and this deeply rooted, then it is entirely reasonable to suggest that early humans deliberately exposed themselves to smoke from psychoactive plants long before they cultivated those plants, long before pottery existed, and long before anyone invented a pipe. They did not need formal equipment to discover that certain smoke changed the mind. Experience was enough. Maybe they deliberately burned particular plants during ceremonies. Maybe they chose campsites near certain species because they already understood their effects. Maybe they slowly learned which smoke made a person calm, euphoric, or visionary, and which smoke made that person feel as though death had entered the lungs. With some plants, learning the difference only happens once. This was prehistoric trial and error. The stakes were extremely high, and sometimes they were literally fatal. But the people who survived remembered what happened. They warned others. They repeated what worked. They passed the information from one generation to the next, preserving knowledge that was never written down but was repeatedly lived. For most of human history, that was how knowledge survived. Not through universities, not through libraries, through experience carried from mouth to ear beside a fire after dark. This is also where my own view of the story changes. I do not think the most important moment was the first time someone inhaled smoke and felt strange. That may have been accidental. The more human achievement came afterward, when one person turned a private experience into collective knowledge. Someone had to remember the plant, explain the effect, describe the risk, and teach the next person what not to do. A sensation might last a few hours. A warning could keep an entire group alive for generations. And that brings us to a part of smoking history that is often ignored. Smoking as medicine. Long before smoke became recreational, and perhaps even before it became spiritual, it may have served a medical purpose. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts in the world, was written in ancient Egypt around 1550 BC. It includes treatments that involved inhaling smoke from heated herbs, especially for problems affecting the throat and lungs. From a modern perspective, this sounds completely backward. The ancient Egyptians treated lung conditions by making people inhale smoke? Yes, that is exactly what they did. And although the method sounds absurd today, some of the plants they used, including henbane and various aromatic herbs, contain compounds with real pharmacological effects when inhaled. The ancient Greeks also used fumigation and therapeutic smoke on a regular basis. Hippocrates, the physician whose name still survives in the oath associated with modern medicine, wrote about inhaling herbal vapors to treat lung diseases and other conditions. By the logic of the time, the idea was not irrational. Smoke travels directly into the lungs. If a plant contains a medicinal compound, then carrying that compound through the breath seems like an efficient delivery method. The lungs become a pathway for medicine, inhaled treatment. We still rely on that principle today through asthma inhalers, anesthetic gases, and nebulizers. The delivery route survived. Thankfully, the burning part mostly did not. Ancient Indian Ayurvedic medicine, with traditions extending back more than 3,000 years, described a practice known as dhumapana, literally drinking smoke. It involved inhaling medicinal herbs through tubes or pipes. The medical texts did not treat this casually. They listed particular plants, particular preparations, and particular conditions. This was not improvised experimentation by someone throwing random leaves into a fire. It was an organized medical system supported by detailed instructions and refined through centuries of repeated use. Across ancient China, Mesopotamia, Greece, India, and nearly every early civilization for which records survive, we find evidence of people deliberately inhaling smoke for therapeutic reasons. It was considered legitimate medicine, not because everyone involved was addicted, not because they wanted to look impressive, because it produced results, or at least because it produced results often enough for people to continue doing it. And in a world with no antibiotics, no modern surgery, and none of the medical technologies we now consider basic, work sometimes was a meaningful standard. There is one more part of this story that deserves far more attention: social bonding. Humans are intensely social animals. We evolved inside groups. And for most of our history, the strength of those groups determined who lived and who died. A group had to remain united, trust one another, and move together during danger. Individuals left alone often died. Groups endured. Anything that made people feel more connected could therefore carry real survival value. Shared rituals are especially powerful in this regard, including rituals in which people consume psychoactive substances together. When a group enters an altered state at the same time, the experience can produce a powerful feeling of trust, connection, and mutual understanding that is difficult to create through ordinary conversation. Modern neuroscience has provided evidence for this shared ritual behavior can synchronize patterns of neural activity, strengthen trust, and deepen group identity in ways that researchers can observe and measure. So when ancient people gathered inside a closed shelter, inhaled smoke from cannabis or other herbs, and entered an altered state together, the event was not necessarily just entertainment. It could function as social technology. It could help create the deep trust required for people to enter dangerous situations together and still believe that everyone would protect everyone else. A communal smoke ritual was not merely an ancient party. It was part of the infrastructure that held the group together. And this is where the story takes an uncomfortable turn. The journey from sacred smoke to an everyday habit is historically an absolute disaster. When tobacco reached Europe in the 16th century, it spread with astonishing speed. Within just a few decades, smoking had gone from an exotic curiosity to an obsession across the continent. By the 1600s, tobacco was traded around the world. By the 1700s, snuff, powdered tobacco inhaled through the nose, had become fashionable among the European aristocracy. By the 1800s, cigars were everywhere. Then, in the early 1900s, the mass-produced cigarette arrived, making tobacco cheaper, easier to use, and more addictive than ever before. What indigenous peoples had spent thousands of years weaving into a careful, ritualized, and deeply cultural tradition was transformed by European industrialists into a mass-market consumer product in barely 4 centuries. The 20th century made things even worse. Tobacco companies spent decades and billions of dollars hiding evidence that cigarettes caused cancer, even evidence collected by their own scientists. They marketed cigarettes to children, hired doctors to endorse smoking, and engineered cigarettes with chemicals that made nicotine hit the brain faster, wear off sooner, and keep people reaching for the next one. An ancient communal ritual became a product designed to maximize addiction, disease, and profit. Personally, I think the plant itself was never the real problem. The difference was how people chose to use it. A shaman and a tobacco executive both worked with tobacco, but almost nothing else connected them. The distance between a shaman in 500 BC using cannabis in a sacred burial ritual and a tobacco executive in 1960 approving cigarette ads aimed at teenagers is one of the greatest moral divides in human history. Both involve smoke. Almost everything else is different. So, when did ancient humans first begin smoking? The honest answer is that nobody knows for certain. And the truth is, we may never know. The archaeological evidence allows us to say with reasonable confidence that the practice reaches back at least 12,000 years, while other clues leave open the possibility that its origins stretch much further into the past. The instinct behind smoking, the desire to alter consciousness, to share powerful rituals with others, or to use inhaled plants as medicine, is almost certainly far older than any pipe, hearth, or artifact archaeologists have uncovered. It may be as old as humanity's first controlled fires. It may even reach back to the very cognitive leap that helped make us human. The ability to notice cause and effect. To remember that a certain burning plant changed the way you felt before, and to deliberately repeat the experience. That isn't addiction, it's intelligence. What we do know is remarkably clear. This behavior is incredibly ancient. It existed before agriculture. It existed before pottery. It existed long before every civilization you learned about in school. By the time written history begins in every part of the world where humans lived, people were already finding ways to intentionally inhale smoke. The plants were different. The rituals were different. The reasons were different. But the behavior itself was already ancient long before anyone thought to record it. Personally, I think that's one of the most beautiful continuities in human history. For all the things separating us from our ancestors, modern medicine, electricity, the internet, and the endless stream of content competing for our attention, some threads have never been broken. Fire, smoke, breath. The earliest humans gathered around campfires and breathed the same smoky air you would smell around a bonfire today. At some point, someone noticed what certain smoke did to the mind. Then people began choosing it. Then they taught that knowledge to their children, who passed it to the next generation, until it eventually reached the Scythians shouting with delight inside smoke-filled tents. Egyptian physicians prescribing henbane, Mayan shamans searching for visions in rising smoke, and the Taino people watching bewildered Europeans try tobacco for the first time and cough until tears filled their eyes. So the next time you switch on a light, sit beside a summer campfire, or catch the scent of wood smoke drifting through a cold evening, remember that you're taking part in something far older than it seems. You're doing what humans have always done. You're breathing.